Hi and welcome to the live stream today with the Third Testament Foundation. We're going to take a look into some sections of the Book of Life 5. Before we do that, let me just do a little bit of intro to the text. Martinez talks about the animal and the human side of our behavior, of being, our consciousness, and that's very relevant because we're actually situated on this planet here that is going from the what Martinez calls the animal kingdom, symbolized by the orange color, into the real human kingdom, symbolized by the yellow color. So we see how this planet here is, planet Earth is moving counterclockwise in its spiral cycle of evolution. And we see the star, which symbolizes the entrance into the real human kingdom, dominated by all love, like everybody's loving their neighbor. And that's the contrast to the animal kingdom, where everybody is selfish and territorial and just taking care of their own and their offspring. So this dynamic of moving out of the animal kingdom, we see how the orange is tapering off as the yellow is increasing. That means that the killing principle is waning and the loving energy, the energy of love, is waxing. So that, however, takes a long time. Martina talks about this period from the planet moving here to there, from where it is now to the star, would take about 3,000 years. Another talk, he said it could be 2,000 years. So, but that, what he means, that's when everybody here on the planet has gone through that. So you see there's some beings that's a little further ahead. Of course, that won't take that long as the beings that are way down here, right? So, but it takes a long time before that we really will experience this new earth, the new heaven on this planet as a physical realm on this planet, where all the resources are distributed fairly and equally, instead of today where it is hoarded by the few. And so I think we just go into the reading of the text, and it's not so long today, so we'll get through it. Let me just read the abstract or the titles of each of the sections here. The Road to Initiation, or the Great Birth. So again, this star symbolizes the Great Birth, yeah, the activation of the intuition energy, which is this blue, symbolized by this blue energy. That is the Great Birth, or the cosmic birth. The Road to Initiation, or the Great Birth. Something distorted or unsound in the terrestrial human being's sympathetic faculties. Why let outdated traditions based on the opinions of the flock, naivety, and superstition obstruct the way to an honest study of the sympathetic faculties, or the true principle of neighborly love, without which an absolute world peace cannot possibly be created? How the struggle for gold becomes a sowing and reaping of unhappy fate for its originator. The terrestrial human beings' present life. The terrestrial human being's present life is, to a dominating extent, merely dressage and an imaginary freedom maintained by propaganda lies. Since all well-being is a question of love, love must be the fulfillment of life. It's Alpha and Omega. So again, this is the love of the real human kingdom, symbolized by the yellow color, and inevitably we can see that the yellow color will take over and we'll have this paradise on earth, because everybody will love everybody, right? So Let's dig into the text here. Having now gained detailed knowledge from the many pages of explanation in Leaves Bow, we know that this organic function of neighborly love, a phenomenon that appears outside the sphere of the reproductive or procreative process, has already long since become evident in the terrestrial human being. Indeed, we know that it is actually this that distinguishes the human being from the animal and causes the animal to be described as a human being. He who really wants to attain initiation or the great birth, he who really wants to familiarize himself with the solution to the mystery of life and arrive at cosmic clarity with regard to the mystery of his own I, must understand that the road to this inevitably goes through him recognizing that which is finished or completed in his own person, and that which is unfinished or incomplete, that which is animal in his consciousness and must therefore perish, and that which is human in his consciousness and must therefore endure or continue. If his preference for the phenomena of the animal nature in his consciousness is still so strong that it is impossible for him to acknowledge these as something that must perish, as something that belongs to a lower world, and which he therefore of necessity must grow or evolve out of, he has still not finished acting out these phenomena. This unfinished state in his consciousness will then become apparent as a more or less strong antipathy towards beings in whom these human phenomena are more or less to the fore, and any assertion that these are a sign or expression of a more advanced stage of evolution or higher moral step. This antipathy can even grow into hatred and persecution. What then are these phenomena that can arouse so much antipathy or downright persecution and hatred? Indeed, the entire problem is in actual fact merely a question of love. It is a question of how much sympathy or fellow feeling one is charged with and can express. Despite the fact that the entire evolution of life, when it comes to mankind's welfare, is a matter of sympathy or love, since all terrestrial human misery, wars, accidents, sufferings, poverty, hunger, and squalor are due solely to a lack of sympathy or neighborly love. There is within this mankind, as previously mentioned, a vast wave of antipathy, hatred, and persecution towards any sympathy or love that is outside the traditional mating love or love of offspring. The amount of sympathy between two beings of the same sex one will or can tolerate is thus very limited, while one fully accepts sympathy between beings of opposite sexes, even in cases where this sympathy results in seduction, divorce, shame, and disgrace. All this clandestine sexual debauchery, this sexual pleasure that is often degraded to an article of commerce and bought by people who have already made a solemn promise of marital fidelity and responsibility, where this debauchery causes immeasurable sufferings and anguish and destroys homes, disrupts the protection and the upbringing of children of this marriage, is not nearly as great and sensational an object of gossip as two beings of the same sex looking at one another too warmly or giving one another a handshake that was too long, according to the gossip's accepted concepts, despite the fact that their doing so has not given rise to the very slightest trouble or misfortune for any being whatsoever. This latter phenomenon is thus a far easier victim of gossip than the former. and one has to be rather advanced in evolution in order to resist the temptation to spread such a sensation, despite the fact that by doing so one damages society or one's neighbor far more than the beings one is speaking ill of do in the given situation. These analyses are not put forward here in order to criticize clandestine sexual pleasure or the gossips and the followers of gossip, but, on the contrary, solely in order to show life as it really is, and thus not as one believes or imagines it must be because of old traditions or handed down, now outdated moral concepts. Now it ought to be established as a fact for every truly intellectual and honest researcher that there is something distorted and completely unsound, something unfinished in terrestrial mankind's sympathetic faculties. If these sympathetic faculties were perfect, there would be no war, need, or misery. Hatred and persecution would exist only within the animal kingdom. But if the deepest roots of all terrestrial human misery happen to lie in the sympathetic faculties, why then not be open and honest about everything of importance that can help one see these faculties in scientific light? Why allow oneself to be led by current opinions of the flock and dogmatic traditions based on ignorance and superstition? Why allow an unintellectual or animal feeling to block one's intelligence? The faculty through which the problem can easily be observed and become a reality. Thousands of people the world over have indeed a faculty of intelligence that far surpasses the capacity needed or required in order to see what a radiant, appropriate significance the sexual structure or the sympathetic faculties are intended to have for mankind. Indeed, one can even say that the lasting peace desired by all terrestrial human beings can never become an absolute reality as long as the beings are superstitious and deluded about the evolution of the faculties or the organic function that is the foundation of the sympathy or neighborly love that is essential to the existence of a real, absolute world peace. Since world peace and the resulting liberation from the physical darkness that overshadows and controls the lives of terrestrial human beings is solely a question of fellow feeling or neighborly love, this fellow feeling or neighborly love is worth more than gold. And yet, terrestrial human beings fight desperately for gold because they believe that possessing it will bring them peace, happiness, and well-being. This is why the various population groups or flocks that we call nations have standing armies and navies. This is why they create huge armament factories and huge fortifications, atomic bomb installations, and so on. This is why they create huge laboratories with hundreds of researchers and workers whose sole purpose is to invent even better weapons of destruction with which to combat their enemies, partly in order to keep the gold, the material worldly goods that they have conquered, and partly in order to take possession of the gold that the enemies have been able to capture. But since the enemies are one's neighbor, and one's neighbor is one's fellow beings, and one's fellow beings are life, all unkindness, all fighting against one's fellow beings will be the same as a fight against life itself. But since no being can isolate itself from life, but is inseparably connected to it with its own life, it is thereby intrinsically and inseparably connected to and dependent on the lives of other beings, together with which it forms the element that is the domicile, experience, and fate of the I. The single individual's mentality of psyche, their thoughts, will, and expression of desire are each a drop in an ocean. This ocean is thus life. Whether this life is to be hell or the kingdom of heaven, a dark or light fate for the individual will thus depend on its own dark and light efforts in this life. It can, of course, experience this life only through its own efforts. If it were isolated from this life, it could not possibly experience anything whatsoever and would consequently be equally incapable of creating its fate. Fate is thus exclusively identical to its own efforts on behalf of and interaction with its fellow beings, its neighbor. As we see, one's daily way of being is a seed one sows, and whose harvest becomes a part of the experience of the future life that one cannot exist without. Whatever one does, however one lives, one's daily life is an interaction with one's surroundings and the various living beings placed there. These beings are thus a part of our own life. Indeed, they are, as previously mentioned, drops of the same ocean, the same element. They cannot, therefore, avoid constituting a part of our experience. The well-being of these surroundings and the fellow beings thereby becomes correspondingly a part of our own well-being or fate. The eternal words, "What a man sows, that he will also reap," are here established as fact. True love and the absolute peace and humane culture that results from it is thus, when analyzed at its most profound level, not a question of money, a question of punishment, or a question of making a living. It is not a question of politics or religion. It is not a question of dictatorship or monarchy, nor is it a question of weapons, armies and navies, currencies, customs duty, or any of the other current material phenomena that are all, without exception, dictated orders that are obeyed merely out of fear of punishment. But a culture that can be maintained only by the being's fear of punishment is but a dressage, where the beings have sunk to the stage of the animal, and their so-called sovereign nation or state can thereby be likened only to a menagerie or a circus in which the beings possess only an imaginary freedom maintained by an authorized propaganda that is far removed from the real truth. But an immature and an unfinished stage in evolution must, of course, be characterized in this way and cannot be blamed on any individual being. Who can change the law that determines that an apple has a sour stage that precedes its ripe, sweet, and tasty stage? Terrestrial human beings must thus learn to understand their own situation, their own cosmic stage in the cycle. They can no longer avoid focusing their science on this situation and making neighborly love or the sympathetic faculties in the living being the object of their studies. Terrestrial mankind has long since entered an epoch where it, from morning to evening, from night to day, year in and year out, generation after generation, century after century, to a great extent experiences a deadly and stifling hunger for love in daily life, in marriage, in family life, in business life, in the workplace, in religiosity, as well as in politics. Everywhere it is still a constant, almost insurmountable struggle to give rather than to take. To turn the right cheek when struck on the left rather than to defend oneself with equal brutality or violence, and be a real man, a real retaliator of hatred and anger rather than a truly humane, civilized, peaceful human being that, through its cosmic understanding, is immune to hatred, anger, and bitterness. Indeed, are not all these unconquered low-culture phenomena precisely the foundation on which unrest, war, or the Day of Judgment are based? Is it not a matter of urgency to make love or the sympathetic faculties an object of scientific inquiry? How can peace become a reality without a science that can reveal to mankind the naivety and ignorance with which it actually protects unrest by law? How can one create peace by establishing, maintaining, and glorifying principles that directly or indirectly must give rise to war, hatred, and persecution between the beings, instead of the principles that give rise to harmony, joy, and well-being? There will thus be no other way to peace, initiation, and clear-sightedness than following the greatest answers to life's questions given to us by mankind's very greatest sages, all of whom express love as the fulfillment of all the laws, and thereby the only thing that can be peace, joy, and well-being. Love and peace are thus inseparable. They are identical. They are the fulfillment of life. And well-being is exclusively a question of love. Love is the keynote of the universe. It is the alpha and omega of life. And with those words, that's a little excerpt from the Third Testament Book of Life, Volume 5. I'd like to end this live stream today with the Third Testament Foundation. For the record, all symbols are copyright of the Materials Institute. If you have any questions, you're welcome to call in, leave a message on the voicemail, or text your questions or any topics that you would like us to cover in these live streams. Please let us know at 1-941-462-3177. Thank you, and see you soon.